This whole video is all about drawing the new ideas that are present on the Korean ladder and showing you guys what they over there are doing on this patch. If any of these builds happen to be inspiring you to learn a new champion, make sure you go check out our website to find more guides on them. And even if you aren't looking for a guide on that champion in particular, why wouldn't you go there? There are tons of guides that are all made by challenger level players on just about any topic that you could ever need to improve at League. One of the things that I noticed several of you guys pointing out is that pretty often there are some builds where it's just like one small change here, an item subbed out, a rune changed, whatever it might be, and that doesn't feel significant enough to you guys to really matter. So here this time, I'm going to try and minimize the things that are really small changes and then actually focus on things that have a really big overall change instead. If you guys like the changes, make sure you hit the like button so that I know you're actually feeling like the new content is better, and don't forget to subscribe so that you could catch the other content that we have coming your way. And speaking of the small stuff, I'm going to start with that because it's going to get out of the way relatively quickly. The first thing that I'm going to mention is that Jinx right now on the Korean server is having way better performance with fleet footwork than any other precision keystone right now. And it's not because the rune has a super small pick rate either. It actually has 20% pick rate, which is pretty comparable to Conqueror's and Lethal Tempo's roughly 40%. If you happen to want to try out this particular build with the new rune change, then combine it with Presence of Mind, Bloodline, Coup de Grace, Nimbus Cloak, and Gathering Storm, with attack speed, adaptive, and armor in your minor runes, and of course Flash and Heal. And the item build has no changes. You would still want to go with Infinity Edge, Berserker Greaves, Runons, and then probably a Rapid Fire Cannon, and then a Death Stance and maybe a GA if you need even more defense. If you don't need more defense, then of course one of the Last Whisper items would be something to round out your build with. Jinx isn't the only champion that has a unique rune that seems to be performing better over there, and it's hard to say exactly why these runes might be doing better, but it's worth trying and looking into yourself if it actually interests you. The other champion who has something like this is Fiddlesticks, where in Korea, almost everybody prefers Predator, and it's performing a lot better than Electrocute or Dark Harvest. Players over there are opting for Predator with Cheap Shot, Zombie Ward, Ingenious Hunter, Nimbus Cloak, and Water Walking with double adaptive and armor in their minor runes. Since you're jungling, you better be taking Flash Smite, and again, the item build has no change here. The only real change is taking Predator rather than Electrocute or Dark Harvest. Runic Echoes, Sork Shoes, and Zanyas are still your core items, with Morel and Amicon and Leandri's fitting in as you need them, followed up with a Rabadon's and then a Void Staff, of course, to maximize your damage. The last small thing that I'm going to talk about is building Muramana on just about any AD carry. Right now, that item is in an amazing position because it's super cheap and offers you the most damage when it actually upgrades into Muramana. That's not to say that the time period between transformation is weak. It's actually pretty good, especially when you consider how cheap the item actually is, and the mana can help many AD carries who have mana problems. With that being said, it might seem like it's super OP, but it's not always the right choice to make. If your goal is to do as much damage as you possibly can around like the 20-minute mark, then Muramana is going to be the thing you want to buy, or well, Manamune, which will then eventually upgrade into a Muramana. Players are experimenting with this, but there's really not enough stats yet to say if it's actually worth it, but it's something that people over there are playing around with, and really people worldwide are starting to play around with. If you want more explanation, I actually covered this in our recent Broken Tricks video, so you should go watch that if you want more info on Muramana on 80 carries. Now we can actually jump into champions who have major changes about what they built. The first one is going to be Jhin. He actually kind of expands upon the thing that I just talked about with the Manamune first item on an 80 carry, because that's exactly what this build is about. For runes, you're going to want to take Comet with Nimbus Cloak, Transcendence, Gathering Storm, Presence of Mind, and Coup de Grace with adaptive, and armor in your minor runes, and you could take Flash and Heal, but if you really need it, you have other options like Cleanse or Exhaust. I see this on players in Korea all the time, as they really adapt to what the enemy team is bringing. Like I said earlier, you want to build Manamune first, and immediately afterwards, you're still going Swiftness Boots. The whole goal of Jhin is to be able to kite people, run around quickly, and not get caught. And when you have Manamune to augment your damage when it actually upgrades into Muramana, you start hitting really hard, even before you finish your second item, assuming that you have the item stacked before then. If nothing else, you spike super hard at 2 items, because right when you finish your Infinity Edge, your Muramana should be transforming. And after that, you can go for a Rapid Fire Cannon, and then a Death Stance, and then a Lord Dominic's Regards. This makes you surprisingly hard to kill, and you hit extremely hard, because both your R and your W count to activating Muramana. It can be pretty spicy, and I've seen it in action, and it is quite strong. If you're a Jhin player, I highly recommend you try mixing things up with this, and even if you're not, you may as well try him out if you're looking for a new AD carry to pick up, because this could be something that takes Jhin to the top of the AD carry list. The second champion I'm going to be talking about here is Nocturne, and this is specifically for Nocturne in lanes, although it is worth mentioning that this is viable in the jungle as well. It just comes with a pretty heavy playstyle change, and you gotta decide if that's actually worth it. In Korea, we can see that some Nocturne mid players are actually opting to choose a different build in both their items and runes. For runes, they're taking Electrocute with Sudden Impact, Eyeball Collection, Ultimate Hunter, Presence of Mind, and Coup de Grace with attack speed, adaptive, and armor in their minor runes, and of course, Still Flash Ignite. Switching from Lethal Tempo to Electrocute very obviously shows you that these players are valuing burst damage on their engage a lot more. And it makes sense because the meta is slowly shifting to champions that are squishier, and also people are slowly losing mobility patch by patch. They're not just swapping their runes and keeping the same exact build either, they are switching up the order of their items to reflect what they're trying to do. These players are rushing a Tiamat as always, and then a Duskblade, but then they're following it up with their Berserker Greaves and an Edge of Night. They're not going for an early Black Cleaver at all, and they will eventually get it next if they actually want it, but sometimes they don't even build that. Several players will instead opt for a Trinity Force if they realize that they want the cooldown reduction, but simply don't need the armor shred because people aren't building a significant amount of armor. After that, they buy a Death Dance to complete their cooldown reduction at 40% and be incredibly hard to kill, and then finally they'll complete their Tiamat into a Ravenous Hydra to finish everything out. That's not something that you should do every game because it can be really valuable to buy something like, say, a Phantom Dancer, a Sterix, a Guardian Angel, or maybe something like a Wit's End, depending on what kind of team you're running up against. It'll be interesting to see how this burst-oriented Nocturne starts to evolve over the patch, because it's been a long time since he's taken anything but lethal tempo, and really ever strayed away from Black Cleaver at least some point inside the build. Next up, let's talk about Skarner, and he's somebody who got directly changed on this patch, and honestly, when I saw this build, I could not believe my eyes. These players have taken the fact that Skarner got max HP damage and completely run away with everything. There's two different rune sets that they really tend to take, and they're Predator with Cheap Shot, Eyeball Collection, Ingenious Hunter, Nimbus Cloak, and Water Walking with attack speed, adaptive, and armor in the minor runes, or Phase Rush with Nimbus Cloak, Celerity, Water Walking, Magical Footwear, and Cosmic Insight. The two differences between these builds is that one focuses on having another tool to engage with, and the other one is not having a problem engaging, but they really want to get people far away and disengage more easily. Both are centered around movement speed, and really it's up to you to decide which one you need in the game that you're playing. If the enemy team has something like a Nasus, I mean, hey man, Phase Rush is going to do you some serious good. Now the item builds are where I had to really blink super hard and be like, what? Is that real? Because these players are going Cinderhulk with Tabby or Murtress depending on the enemy team, and then going Righteous Glory. So far, understandable. But then they're going for a Shirelia's, and then a Deadman's, and then a Stoneplate. Some players also tend to get Stoneplate earlier because I'm assuming that they jump off the movement speed bus and they're like, okay, we have enough. And at that point, that's actually what I recommend you do, because it's really overkill and you don't have as much tankiness as you would like, because your health pool isn't particularly large, and you really only have movement speed at that point. You might also be seriously suffering in the magic resist department, especially if you happen to skip out on Merc Treads. This one's definitely an interesting build, and compared to before, it's actually performing better than the Conqueror Skarner of the past, and that still is around, to be clear. Players are sometimes still going Conqueror and building stuff like Warriors or Trinity Force, but this is the brand new stuff, and it doesn't seem bad by any stretch of the imagination. It just seems kind of silly because it's super overkill, and you're really only looking to like drag people into your Nexus, I guess, because really that's all the build is all about. This is one of those builds that you need to look out for because it might be constantly changing, and we could very well be on the edge of a brand new Skarner build. Now, I left the Summoner spells for last because you really have two options here, and obviously you're taking Smite, so that's not what I'm talking about when I say two options. You could either be a completely normal and sane person and choose Flash, or you could jump off the deep end and take Ghost. I really don't recommend you do the second one, but if you're looking for memes, well, make sure you got the initial D soundtrack queued up before you lock in the champion. And if you're unsure of what I'm talking about, you should definitely go look it up because it is all bangers on that playlist. It really brings a new meaning to playing a champion that can move at hyperspeed. Alright, Skarner's had enough of a spotlight, so let's move on to the next champion, which is Gnar, who recently got a buff, and it did a lot more than I thought it would do, because we see a pretty convincing change in the build. The runes are still relatively similar, but players are choosing between press the attack and fleet footwork, depending on whether the enemy can actually deal damage to them or not. Usually Gnar is pretty comfortable with a decent range advantage, but sometimes you're getting autoed by a Teemo, or, they're picking a champion that's just straight up cheating, like Lucian, Vayne, or Quinn, something like that, right? And you would prefer to have fleet footwork for sustain. This also works if the enemy is able to all-in you a lot by jumping on top of you. Regardless of your choice for your precision keystone, you're going to be following it up with Triumph, and then Alacrity and Last Stand. Splashing into Domination to pick up Taste of Blood and Ravenous Hunter for even more healing and sustain, and of course, Attack Speed, Adaptive, and Armor in your minor runes. If you're up against magic damage, don't forget to swap over to the Magic Resist. As is standard for most top laners, you're also going to be taking Flash and Teleport, and for items, things start out relatively normal, as Gnar pretty much always builds a Black Cleaver. But once you pick up your Tabbies or Merctres, that tends to be where the similarities stop. That's because these Gnar players, depending on how good they're snowballing, will pick up a Death Stance or a Blade of the Ruined King, and then whichever one they didn't get immediately afterwards. Death Stance is great for survivability and winning those really tight duels, but if you're already smashing somebody's head in because of the huge attack speed buffs that Gnar got, then you're going to be able to just take Blade of the Ruined King and run somebody down and destroy them. With this build, you truly deal a very surprising amount of damage, and honestly, I fell to this once too. I laned against Sonara's Jax. I wasn't too convinced that the buff was going to do too much, but the man absolutely smashed things open, and by the time he had a Black Cleaver and a Blade of the Ruined King, I was dying left and right because I really just couldn't do anything. And you can put your opponents in that position if you're playing this champion with this build correctly. Once you have all those damage items, or really like bruiser-ish items, you gotta tank up somehow because you're probably going to start showing up to team fights, and you need to make sure that you aren't just dying immediately before you can get your sick combos off. Stone Plate after you get your Blade of the Ruined King and Death Stance is really powerful because it will give you both resistances, and you're already pretty tanky with your health bar, especially when you transform to Mega Gnar. Being able to double that and supplement it with the resists is insanely strong. And then last item, it's a resistance item of your choice. If you're looking for magic resist, Spirit Visage will be very powerful since you do have a ton of healing. But if you actually need more armor, then you probably want to go something like a Thorn Mail, or maybe even a Randuin's if people have an insane amount of crit and aren't really relying on lifesteal. But, I mean, right now in this meta, with Death Stance, Blade of the Ruined King existing, and people taking Bloodline or whatever the heck else like Conqueror, you probably want a Thorn Mail, let's be real. The last champion here is gonna be Amumu, and he's pretty unpopular. I mean, that's why he cries all the time, right? But, believe it or not, he's actually played enough in Korea to show up on stat reporting websites. And there's something that I noticed there that really doesn't happen anywhere else. These players are always taking Aftershock with Font of Life, Conditioning, Overgrowth, Cheap Shot, and Ultimate Hunter, with Attack Speed, Adaptive, and Armor in their minor runes, and of course Flash and Smite. There's a lot of important things that you could do with Flash, so you need to take it on Amumu because it can augment your engages super hard. Taking Aftershock isn't exactly foreign on Amumu, nor is taking Domination as a secondary, but what is different is the combination of the runes and the items. Because we've seen people go, Dark Harvest or Electrocute full AP, and you see people go Aftershock full tank, but what about everything in between? These players are taking Aftershock and then building Runic Echoes with Sorc shoes if they can get away with it. Sometimes they go for the defensive shoes, but if your enemies are building a ton of magic resist, there's really no point for it. Ideally, they're not, and you pick up an Oblivion Orb after your Sorcerer shoes so that you just seriously burst out pretty much anybody that you can breathe on. Afterwards, Zanya's, because you're going in and after your Aftershock is over, you need to somehow survive, will really help you out. And then after that, you can finish Morello's and follow that up with a Rabadon's into a Void Staff. If you didn't get a Morellonomicon because you didn't buy an Oblivion Orb, because you didn't buy Sorc Shoes, because you saw your enemy team had Magic Resist already, then you could get a Liandry's as well in the later stages of the game to really help you out with some sick burn damage. Just keep in mind, you're only going for the Sorc Shoes plus the Oblivion Orb if the enemy team isn't building any Magic Resist, or they're just filled with squishies who really aren't going to get enough. But that's all the Korean builds for patch 10.15, and some are more spicy than others, that's for sure. but all of them are pretty unique, and even some of them abuse very specific mechanics. Don't forget to go check out our website, GameLeap.com, to have guides on any of these champions and more, and of course there's also other guides up there too. Everything we have up there is made by challenger level players, so you're always getting stuff from the best sources possible, and it's the best place to go to learn and improve at League. And if you made it this far, thanks for watching the whole video. And as always, my name is Ace Windstorm, and I will see you all later.